students who are ready to take university entrance examination. This concerns history of grade 12, unit 2, Africa and the colonial experience from the 1880s to 1960s. Subscribe this video, okay, and as much as possible you try to subscribe, share the video, and it's very important, valuable for those within Ethiopia, in Addis, or just in the regional states, and even outside of Ethiopia, who are attending class through the distance education. Okay, I'm presenting you in English here, and some few days after, I will upload another video in Amharic. So let me move to Unit 2, Africa and the colonial experience, 1880s to 1960s. It's improper, as I've said in the introduction part, because I have already uploaded Unit 1 of grade 12 history, and in that introductory part, I have explained that it's improper, or no way to say, to mention of ancient African history or medieval or modern African history. Rather, we should use these terms: pre-colonial African history, okay, colonization period of African history, and post-independence. So this period before 1880s, okay, pre-colonial, covers the period at the time when Africans had established their own empires before the arrival of an organized European colonial rule. And this one, Unit 2, refers to the period from the 1880s to the 1960s, this one, the middle one. And the post-independence in the end. In grade 12, there is a portion concerning post-independence, how Africans achieved their independence, being free from colonial yoke. Introduction. This unit discusses the main historical developments in Africa from the 1880s to the 1960s. The period of European colonization is the focus of this unit and involves lessons such as the process of colonization, African resistance against colonial expansion, we'll see all this, colonial administration, and the colonial states. I advise you just to identify these terms which are frequently mentioned in this video: resistance, legitimate, trade ideology, colonialism, indirect rule, process of colonization, and direct rule. Let's start. 2.1. The area of legitimate trade and colonial empires. The birth and expansion of the legitimate trade. Here it says the transatlantic slave trade was referred to as illegitimate trade, unlawful, illegal trade, that means, because its commodities were humans or slaves rather than other goods. Slaves here were the commodities, humans considered as commodities, and some historians call them like speaking tools. Okay, partly they were sold, they were bought, Okay, actually, those slaves were found in Africa, in the continent of Africa, as well as they were transported in America. Okay, their cheap labor was highly demanded on plantation farmers on American soil. So, buying and selling of humans or slaves was considered as illegitimate trade, which was unlawful, illegal. But take like the American Constitution, it couldn't just uh, become part of its constitution, okay, until 1865. Slaves were slaves. So after the end of the transatlantic slave trade and the success of the abolitionist campaigns, this was very strong in America and in England, abolitionist campaigns. Scholars, okay, the educated ones, campaigned for the end of, for the abolition of slavery, especially from in Africa, in America. The former trade in humans or African slaves could not continue. As a result of the end of the transatlantic slave trade, there was no way for African for the trade to continue, considering the slaves as commodities for 3 centuries, meaning that from 1500 to 1800, they were bought and sold. The illegitimate trade in humans had dominated the commercial activities in the West African coastal areas. Much of Africa, especially in the coastal part of Africa, here we have, which is coastal parts of Africa, like Senegal, okay, part of Angola, Mozambique. These were the major trading stations where illegitimate trade was so active. After the Industrial Revolution, the European colonial powers, particularly the British, took measures that first weakened and gradually abolished not only the transatlantic slave trade, but also the slave trade in general. It was England. It was England that, or the British, who first practiced the Industrial Revolution, and they found that Industrial Revolution was in conflict with the existence of transatlantic slave trade. This revolution brought industries that needed abundant raw materials, market centers, and area of investment. But here, transatlantic slave trade, which was considered as anachronistic or outdated system, okay, Britain or the British wanted to abolish, to stop this trade, which was not that much important for European industries. The Europeans introduced a new trade in West Africa, which they called the legitimate trade. Okay, changing from just the legitimate trade to legitimate trade. Actually, we can call it as fake trade, fake, deceiving trade. Okay, in words, legitimate trade meaning that Africans could sell their products to Europeans fairly, okay, with agreements. But following this, following the abolition of slave trade, and with the beginning of imperialism in Africa, okay, this legitimate trade was much more in favor of the European whites, colonizers. in which the principal commodities were no more human beings or African slaves. Actually, in the legitimate trade, there was no human being or African slave to be considered as African because it was banned by the British government. But what's important here, those slaves became humans, actually. They were given human rights, but their, their land themselves as well, the humans, the ex-slaves, okay, who were given full human rights. Actually, it's very difficult to mention full human rights because in the coming colonial period, the slaves were almost enslaved, we can say. So, African slaves being commodities stopped legally. Analyze, okay, this is important for you to personally or to discuss concerning this case with your classmates or group members. Okay, during the first half of the 9th century, which means 19th century is 1800 to 1899. So the first half, meaning that the first 50 years, that is 1849. This was the first half of the 9th century. New West African commodities replaced the slaves as merchandise to be exported abroad. And instead of transporting African slaves, African, especially new West African commodities, were transported abroad. These commodities for export included items like gum, ground nuts, and palm. By the middle of the 9th century, which means 1850, palm oil became West Africa's major export items. The palm oil was highly needed, demanded by European merchants to transport it and sell it to American markets. The legitimate trade, even European markets, I could say. The legitimate trade that replaced the illegitimate trade, okay, did not, however, economically prosper the West African states. Nothing became gains for Africans. The West African states, its people, the government of West Africa, the natives, were not economically beneficiaries. Rather, the illegitimate trade highly benefited economically the European colonizers. It rather benefited most African rulers and wealthy merchants. Okay, yeah. It rather, not the ordinary people, it rather benefited the most African rulers. Most African rulers and wealthy merchants who had also much more attachment to European merchants. The new legitimate trade could not bring significant improvement to the majority of West Africans, as I said. The natives, the largest portion of the people of West Africa, were not benefited. Indeed, the living conditions, of course, the living condition of the people could not improve. Okay, still, living condition of African people could not improve. The goods imported from Europe, which were like clothes, alcoholic drinks, the firearms, could not contribute for the development of African native economies. The imported European clothes thoroughly, absolutely weakened the development of the African indigenous craft industry. Indigenous craft industry, which is otherwise cottage industry, okay, including the products produced by craftsmen, native local craftsmen throughout Africa, okay, it weakened the European clothes that came or transported from Europe to Africa, dominated the indigenous craft industry because Europeans brought clothes that were highly shining, attractive compared to African cottage products. African peoples were attracted by imported European goods, as I said. They imported firearms too. Firearms meaning that weapons had a negative impact. They not only undermine the indigenous African weapon making industry, but also enable the African rulers to get military might to plunder their own people. Using those European weapons, African local chiefs, African rulers across the continent, be it north, especially west, and south and east of Africa, used those weapons for plundering their own people. Plundering meaning looting, exploiting their own people. In fact, the imported firearms were not modern in the true sense of the term. In the real sense, okay, those imported firearms were not modern and could not enable African rulers to protect themselves and their people from the colonial powers were equipped with more sophisticated weapons. What they brought and sold to African rulers were not technologically advanced. The weapons were backward compared to the most sophisticated weapons of Europeans. So when they came to colonize Africa, African rulers remained with those backward European weapons and could be easily submitted to European colonizers who came to Africa with more sophisticated weapons. The European merchants who were involved in the legitimate trade in West Africa had succeeded in controlling not only the export trade, but also the internal trade in West Africa as well, which is very clear. Europeans European merchants had succeeded in controlling both export trade and internal trade in West Africa as well. The European traders maximized their profits, okay, meaning that they gained lots of profits. They amassed too much profits as they served as intermediaries between the African merchants and European traders. Because European traders were in between European traders and African merchants, they were acting as bridge, as brokers in between. This increased commercial competition between the European merchants led to the European competition, which eventually culminated, raised up, okay, triggered in the scramble for Africa in the 1870s and 1880s to control source of raw materials and markets. All in all, the increased commercial competition among merchants, okay, or between the European merchants, led to European competition, one another. Okay, one European merchant against the other European merchant. This culminated, raised the situation up. Okay, in the scramble for Africa. Okay, Europeans were about to come to scramble for Africa to control source of raw materials and markets. The infrastructure and ideology of new imperialism, this could be taken as the subtopic. The infrastructure and ideology of New imperialism. Imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. True. Okay, highest stage meaning that the last stage of capitalism, some like 200 years after, okay, or 300 years after early capitalism, we have a developed and matured capitalism, which we call imperialism. When we say new imperialism, we are referring to a period of increased expansion of capitalism that was starting in the second half of the 9th century and continued until the outbreak of the First World War. Second half meaning 1850 to 1899. So this was the second stage. Second stage. Okay, new imperialism showed that there was old imperialism, old capitalism. That was the entry of incursion or colonial attempts and control of like Angola and Congo by the Portuguese colonizers. In the period known as the New Imperialism, European powers wanted to control African colonies. By the way, the word itself does mean what? Imperialism means empire building. Empire building. Okay? Using any means. Firstly, through a peaceful situation, they came to approach African people friendly, and then fake treaties they concluded with African chiefs, like the case of the Wujale Treaty in Ethiopia. And if all this failed, they came to confront Africans with their sophisticated weapons. So imperialism was a kind of reflection of developed capitalism, leading to what? Colonialism. The effects. Imperialism came to Africa, for instance, to start what? To begin with colonialism, meaning that controlling African lands, the people, okay, and amassing lots of abundant profits out of it. European powers wanted to control African colonies. After achieving unification in the early 70s, Germany and Italy joined the struggle to control territories in Africa. These were the newly emerging states that highly needed, after accomplishing their unification process, they highly demanded colonies, raw materials. Okay, Germany, especially, as you know, she claimed, we'll see later on, she claimed and even controlled like Mozambique in the east of Africa, Southwest Africa, nearby South Africa, what's called today Namibia, and further to West Africa, like Cameroon and Togoland. Italy, almost like the case of Libya, northern parts of Africa, and how they strived to get colonies in Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa. You know, the case, their confrontation with Menelik at the Battle of Adwa. So they newly emerged as colonial powers. They joined the struggle to control territories in Africa, it says. Following the rapid economic development that came as a result of adopting the economic policy of free trade, a serious financial crisis affected the Western states in the early 1870s. Okay, following the adoption of economic policy of free trade, meaning taking African slaves to Europe and bringing African finished commodities to Africa. Okay, free trade which was, I could say, the last phase of the transatlantic slave trade. The first was piratic, the second was monopolistic slave trade, and the third was free trade. A serious financial crisis during the third phase affected the Western states in the early 1870s. In order to withstand the economic crisis and protect their economic interests, European states began to take measures. For instance, in the 1870s and 1880s, the two major European colonial powers, Great Britain and France, partitioned the West African part of the African continent into their sphere of influence. There were, as you know, there were old rivals, Great Britain and France. They were enemies, even came into conflict somewhere in parts of Africa, including Egypt. Okay, this is my question presented to you, students. You better discuss or personally try to find something, okay, regarding this question. Okay, now, Berlin Conference of 1884-85 enabled the European powers to divide Africa among themselves. That led to the physical occupation of territories in Africa, which means the intensification of colonial conquest. Berlin, as you know, the capital city of Germany, Germany became the host nation. How much she had accomplished her unification process in 1871. It was almost after 13 years. She began to have territories in Africa within the gap of 13 years. She developed her economy, and plus she built a very strong army. So it was Otto von Bismarck who summoned the great powers of Europe, to divide Africa among themselves, to partition Africa for themselves. There was European presence in Africa even before the start of the period of the new imperialism. It's clear, as I said, Portugal controlled, colonized Congo. The period of the new imperialism differs from the earlier period in the sense that the Europeans came to Africa with a very developed technology, right? As time goes on, especially as a result of the second phase of the Industrial Revolution, developed sophisticated, advanced technology occurred in Europe. Before the 1870s, although the Europeans had contacts with the peoples of coastal areas of Africa, particularly West Africa, they were not equipped with efficient firearms to easily conquer the native people there because they lacked advanced firearms, no efficient firearms. That was before the 1870s because they didn't have the modern firearms, the efficient firearms. Moreover, the Europeans also lacked appropriate means of communication, no way to communicate, to have contact with Europe effectively, to control Africa, particularly the interior parts of Africa, partly not only lack of means of communication, not only the lack of efficient firearms. Moreover, the Europeans do not have any deep knowledge, detailed knowledge about the interior parts of Africa, especially the rivers, to what extent raw materials were there in African rivers. So what it means is almost leading to explorations. In general, the European colonial powers had a great difficulty to penetrate deep, to encroach, to cross the borders deep into the African territory. the African interior had a great difficulty. Was that at the early days of colonization, tsetse fly and mosquito had almost prevented the Europeans from entering the African territory. It is called tsetse fly, sleeping that caused sleeping sickness. Okay, mosquito leading to somebody to have malaria. Okay, there are no cure for both for these two disease problems. Eventually, the European colonizers managed to penetrate deep into the African interior with relative ease, okay, thanks to technological advancement, including the invention of better river balls, steamship, better rifles, and the discovery of medicine to combat malaria. They came up with technological findings. Okay, as a result of their advanced technology, this appeared to occur in Europe and almost paved the way for Europeans to come to Africa because they did have these things. By 1880, a relatively small number of well armed and properly trained European soldiers had managed to easily defeat the native Africans who had a market numerical who had a market sorry who had a market considerable numerical superiority over them. After the second industrial revolution, meaning that after 1850s, many of the European states became technologically more advanced and they developed interest to colonize uncolonized areas in Africa that were not colonized became on the way to be colonized. Okay, because the Europeans were having a technologically more advanced and developed interest together with their these things as were mentioned here, these cases, okay, brought them to Africa. As mentioned above, Germany and Italy were newcomers, right, in the colonial struggle to acquire colonies in Africa. Britain and France, the old colonial possessors, the were territorial possessors, earlier before the arrival of Germany and Italy. But now, these two, after completing their unification, uh, they planted many industries in both the north and south across their regions, and that brought them profits. Using that profit, they built a strong army, both Germany and Italy. So they wanted their industries were in need of, badly in need of raw materials. So they entered as newcomers, they entered in the colonial struggle, they joined the struggle to acquire colonies in Africa. Technology and involvement of new powers in the colonial struggle hastened the development and spread of the new imperialism. Okay, these were factors for Europeans to facilitate the development and the spread of new colonialism. In short, what it means to colonize Africa. Okay, everything was convenient for them. The emerging European industries needed a huge capital investment. Yeah, huge amount of money. Okay, huge amount of money and other materials that are very important in colonizing Africa. Okay, they needed huge capital, huge amount of money. The financial capital required to run the new industries paved the way for the development of financial institutions like banking, capital markets. Okay, these two developed. Okay, together with the financial capital uh, being required to run the new industries. Okay, what important became opening of financial opening and establishing and developing those financial institutions was important, like banking, capital markets that could finance the new industries. The expansion of industries in Europe not only demanded excess raw materials, not only demanded excess what other things they needed, but also importing food to their colonies for the then growing urban population in the industrialized cities and towns. Technological advancement in maritime technology, sea, sea transport, it is maritime, sea transport, and navigation techniques enabled the European colonial powers to get raw materials and food supply. Maritime technology had played a decisive role, only because actually having a technological advancement in the maritime technology had enabled the European colonial powers to get control of raw materials and food supply with relative ease. Traveling is the simplest way to travel even to distant areas, including the Far East. Improving in shipbuilding also encouraged the revival of militarism and aggression in the world. This was very crucial. Shipbuilding, okay, that could navigate across the waters of the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, plus the Indian Ocean, and to reach to Far East, meaning like China, okay, encourage the revival of militarism and aggression. Okay, these things led Europeans to revive their militarism, their aggression. Great Britain, which was the first country to embark on the Industrial Revolution, as I said above, yeah, she was the first to have abolished slave trade, plus to have started both phases of Industrial Revolution, starting from 1750 on. She was in the forefront, the leading great power. She was the starter of the Industrial Revolution. Great Britain was the strongest world power of the period and had supremacy in military and naval power. Supremacy meaning that top, the best of. Overall, everything in the military and naval powers, no other power could compete Great Britain. That means she took the leading position. Its technological superiority enabled Great Britain to build more efficient naval force. As you know, Great Britain is a combination of the mix of Wales, Scotland, Ireland, and England. They are kind of islands, okay, surrounded by the waters of the North Atlantic. So, being an island, England should have efficient naval force. Enemies coming from outside, it was not possible for foreign enemies to attack Great Britain land to land, rather using the sea or the ocean. So she had to have efficient naval force, navy. Soon after, soon other European colonial powers followed suit and modernized their armed force, including their navy. Actually, it's very clear in the 1890s, Germany had already built her navy or her naval power that could compete the British Navy. After the 9th century, the European colonial powers worked hard to consolidate their rule in the areas which they had already occupied. In fact, They also worked to get new colonies, to get new colonies through, although there were no adequate territories to be newly colonized in Africa by then. Okay, they increased their control over the colonies they had already acquired. That means technological boom, meaning that development, unexpected development, boom, increased in technological gains that came as a result of the new imperialism had some negative impacts on people who had their own polities, like African people. They had their own political system. This new, with the arrival of this new imperialism to Africa, it totally changed. Okay, it had a negative impact on African peoples, for instance. The military superior European colonial states now managed to colonize the entire African continent except Ethiopia and Liberia. Actually, up until 1911, Morocco is included here. She was free, like Ethiopia and Liberia. You know why these two? Ethiopia, because of her military strength, pushing back, driven, or repulsing the invaders, Italian conquerors coming to Ethiopia at the Battle of Adwa, as you know. Ethiopians defeated the Italians that granted its national independence, sovereignty. The case of Liberia related to American protection. Liberia was under American, US protection. Uh, Morocco, up until the French came to control it, she was independent. So, except this, all African, the entire African continent, except these 2 and 3 countries, were totally colonized. Many areas in Asia as well, not only Africa, many areas in Asia and the Pacific Islands. Although the European colonization of territories in Africa was started earlier, we did say frequently, the scale had increased dramatically. Now, just after new imperialism began, okay, the scale had increased dramatically, okay, in an unexpected way, and European acquisition of territories reached its peak top, okay, the maximum point during the period known as the new imperialism. Acquisition of, meaning that control of territories reached its peak to the maximum. When the First World War broke out in 1914, about 85% of the territories in the world had fallen under the colonial rule. Amazing. 85%. Only the remaining 15 remained independent. During the First World War, the colonized people followed their colonial masters, paid sacrifice in military confrontations that had nothing to do with them. Okay, the African colonized people, for instance, followed their colonial masters. Like Egypt obeyed the rules of the British colonizers. Okay, so in short, as a whole, to conclude what we have discussed earlier, this was a period following the second half of the second phase of the Industrial Revolution. Okay, it late second phase of the Industrial Revolution came up with like new technologies, machines producing machines, light industries were there, but heavy industries as well increased in number, where for the first time appeared, meaning machines producing machines like automobiles, aircrafts, big ships were built. okay, as a result of the second phase of the industrial revolution after 1850. So uh, Europeans coming to Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, okay, because the industrial revolution brought technological advancements after 1850. So it took them like 30, 40 years to organize themselves and to start colonizing, especially the continent was called Africa. And that's all about for today. This take it as part one, and in the second part, I will join you with a new subtopic, what is called the partition of Africa, how Europeans partitioned Africa, the motives and process. Okay, now for today that's it. Thank you, and don't forget subscribing and sharing my video to for all you know. That's all about. Uh, Thanks for your patience. Okay. By the way, it's better. I advise you to any questions, any complaints. If you do have, you can state on the comments, on the space where there is a space, comment space. Okay, use that. Otherwise, I'll be with you all the time up until the end of Unit 9. As long as I have enough time, I will just try to do exercise with you. I have already uploaded the university entrance examination just some 2 weeks ago, and I will start immediately. I think so next week, 2016, in Amharic, not in English. Okay, in Amharic, and try to follow me regularly. Uh, Thank you again.